Welcome, my friends, to Dr. Frank Cutting Edge Medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Miller, coming to you from San Antonio, Texas. This show is brought to you by O3 Plus, our health, wellness, and longevity clinic here in San Antonio, Texas. The number is 210-558-7778. If conventional medicine has not completely helped you with your ailments, whatever they might be, give us a chance to add such cutting-edge complementary treatments like ozone, IV nutrients, vitamins, EWAT, which is exercising with oxygen therapy, platelet-rich plasma, pulsed electromagnetic field magnets, stem cells, exosomes, peptides, and a wide assortment of supplements. We are also a Dr. Schallenberger-trained site for bioenergy testing. Our skilled nurse practitioner, Kim Engelman, is ready to hear your story and evaluate just which therapy will help you the most. So give us a call at 210-558-7778. Or the website is o3plustexas.com. That's o3plustx.com. All right, well, this recording is happening on, playing on Sunday, so we'll continue with a prayer. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Through your goodness, you've given us nitric oxide, another miracle molecule, to keep us healthy and happy. We thank you for this, God, and we ask you to please bless our guests and open our minds to understand how we can improve our habits so we can stay functional and better serve you. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Well, everybody, I'm really pleased and excited to have a guest by the name of Dr. Nathan Bryan, Ph.D., with us today. He's one of the world's leading authorities and top experts on nitric oxide. How are you doing, Brian? I'm Nathan. Are you there? Uh-oh. I can't hear you either.
I can see you. I can hear you.
Okay, there you are.
All
right.
Great.
So now we have Dr. Nathan Bryan, who he started out at UT Austin, PhD, and then got the PhD at LSU, and then did a fellowship at Whitaker Cardiovascular Institute in Boston, and then he was recruited in 2006 to the UT Health Science Center in Houston for 9 years, where, as I understand it, Nathan, you were involved in trying to keep coronary arteries open. Is that correct?
That was the basis for our original research was, trying to combat cardiovascular disease, the number one killer of men and women worldwide. So
they had you looking at different plants and things to see what kind of a supplement or other medicine, I guess, would help to hold open the arteries, or tell us more about how you got into all the nitric oxide.
Well, I became interested in nitric oxide as a PhD student at LSU School of Medicine in Shreveport, and then when I was at the University of Texas, we were screening a lot of natural product libraries, trying to find, small molecule activators or stimulators of nitric oxide, and we made a lot of discoveries on ways to actually make nitric oxide in the human body.
So, for all of our listeners who don't know what nitric oxide is, give us a primer.
Well, it's a relatively new discovery in the medical literature. It was discovered back in the late 70s, early 80s, but it's a molecule that's produced by the lining of the blood vessels that basically regulates blood flow. So it opens up your blood vessels and improves oxygen and nutrient delivery, but it regulates blood flow to every cell in the body. So, for instance, if you're trying to recall where you left your car keys, you need an increase in blood flow and perfusion to certain regions of the brain, and that's mediated by nitric oxide. It's a neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, and it's how our immune system fights off things like viruses and bacteria or foreign invaders.
So, and when was it discovered?
Well, the original discoveries was in 1980 that, our body makes a substance that causes blood vessels to relax, and this was work by Bob Furchgott, and he didn't know what this molecule was, so we called it endothelium-derived relaxing factor, or EDRF. And then in 1987, it was discovered that this endothelium-derived relaxing factor that's produced by the lining of the blood vessels is actually a nitric oxide gas.
So it actually, do you see it as a bubble in there, or it's so small it doesn't, or how do you have a gas in a liquid medium like a blood vessel?
Well, at standard atmospheric pressure and temperature, it is a gas. And that really makes for an interesting phenomenon in cell signaling, and that's why a Nobel Prize was awarded, because at that time it was unlike any signaling molecule that we knew about, because typically signaling is kind of like a lock and key, and receptor ligand binding, but a gas that can diffuse freely through cell membranes and activate intracellular targets was really a new phenomenon in biology.
So, what did you find as far as how it was produced and how we can get more of it?
Well, when I started as an independent investigator, we were interested in basically answering three questions. And the first one was, how does the body make nitric oxide? What goes wrong in people that can't make nitric oxide? And then what are the clinical consequences of that? So those were the three fundamental kind of really important questions in medicine at the time. And then the fourth question we did was, once we understood all that, how do we make a therapeutic or a technology that can replete and restore nitric oxide in the human body?
So, so how is it made?
Well, now we have a clear understanding of nitric oxide in human physiology. There's really two main pathways where the human body makes nitric oxide. One is through an enzyme called nitric oxide synthase, and that's really what's the method that's produced in the lining of the blood vessels that regulates blood vessel tone and blood pressure, for example.
Is that the one? That's the one that's made out of L-arginine?
That's correct.
Okay.
So arginine is converted to nitric oxide through a very complex 5-electron oxidation reaction. And then the other pathway was, discovered maybe 20, 25 years ago, but through it, there's a dietary influence in this pathway, whereby, inorganic nitrate that's found in primarily green leafy vegetables or even beets is converted into nitrite and nitric oxide in the human body when it's consumed. So now we have a way that we can influence nitric oxide production through dietary patterns and really provide an explanation for a Mediterranean diet, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, a Japanese diet. Basically, everything we've known about nutritional epidemiology can be traced back to its ability to be converted into nitric oxide. Now,
for the audience, Dr. Brian gave us a talk about 2 years ago at our ozone conference, and he was blowing us away with all kinds of new research on a lot of these things, but that's where I learned a fair amount about this. But you had mentioned that by age 40, we don't convert the L-arginine to nitric oxide as well. Is that because the nitric oxide synthetase doesn't work as well as we get older, or what happens?
Yeah, that's right. So there's an age-dependent loss of the function of that enzyme. And so what basically is 10 to 12% per decade. So by the time we're between 40 and 50, and this is generally speaking, everyone's different, but you only have about 50% of the nitric oxide you had when you were younger. And this, I think, is not coincidental that this is the age that people start to feel the effects of aging. They don't perform as well as they did in the bedroom, the boardroom, or on the athletic field, and that's all due to loss of regulation of blood flow. And that can be explained by lack of nitric oxide production.
So then in order to regain it or to restore it, you have to eat your green leafy vegetables, and then they have nitrate. Is that right?
That's correct. Predominantly nitrate, a little bit of nitrite. But a lot of this depends on the freshness, the time of harvest, where they are in the growth stage of the plant cycle. So there's a whole field of agronomy that uses the nitrogen cycle and how do you replete nitrogen in plants and in what form. But primarily it's nitrate that you're getting in green leafy vegetables. And
which ones are the highest in nitric oxide?
Frank, on average speaking, it's your really dark green veggies like kale, arugula, spinach.
Okay.
But, we published a study several years ago showing that it depends on where the plant's grown, whether it's organically grown versus conventionally grown. There's as much as a 50-fold difference in the amount of nitrate in the spinach, for example, if you live in New York versus Dallas versus Chicago. So there's regional farming practices that determine and dictate how much nitrate's in there. Organically grown has on average about a 10 times less nitrate than conventionally grown vegetables. So organic is good in the fact that you're not getting exposed to herbicides or pesticides, but you can't eat enough organic vegetables to replete nitrate levels to the extent that you can produce any meaningful nitric oxide.
So to counter that, I guess, you came up with a product, did you invent the Neo 40 tablets?
That's right. I'm the inventor on that technology.
Mm-hmm. And so I've certainly taken them. I had one today, and it's to the audience, it's like a pink lozenge, and you just suck on it until it dissolves. And in my understanding, it somehow works with the mouth bacteria to release nitric oxide. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, we're not dependent upon the oral bacteria, because I think if we take a step back, we realize that, the oral bacteria, the oral microbiome is extremely important, in fact, essential in converting nitrate into nitrite nitric oxide. And the issue, Frank, is you're probably aware of this, there's over 200 million Americans that wake up every day and use mouthwash. And that daily use of mouthwash eradicates the good bacteria, disrupts the oral microbiome, and basically shuts down any nitric oxide production you're getting from the diet. So 2 out of 3 Americans are using mouthwash. 2 out of 3 Americans have an unsafe elevation in blood pressure. To me, it's not a coincidence. It's explained mechanistically, very simply, by the oral dysbiosis and lack of nitric oxide production. So the challenge for us was if you have a patient that's nitric oxide deficient, whether their oral microbiome is not working or they have endothelial dysfunction and the enzyme isn't working, and patients that can't make nitric oxide, how do you do it? So what we do, and the beauty of the Neo 40, and there's really no technology out there like it, is that when that lozenge is dissolving, it's generating nitric oxide gas, about 20 to 30 parts per million. So if your body can't make nitric oxide, we do it for you. But we've also understood the enzymology of the enzyme to the extent that we recouple that nitric oxide synthase enzyme so we can actually see an improvement in the body's own ability to make nitric oxide. And we see about a 15% improvement in endothelial function within 4 hours of taking a single lozenge.
I believe in your book, by the way, for the audience, I will have links to 2 of his books. One's the Nitric Oxide Solution, and the other one is Functional Nitric Oxide Nutrition. And in one of those, it was talking about that after, I think it was 6 months of using the Neo 40 twice a day, you saw a regression in carotid artery plaque.
That's correct. So what we try to do is do clinically meaningful research. And I think when you begin to assess cardiovascular risk in patients, there are a number of things you can do. You can look at endothelial function. You can look at the amount of plaque that's deposited in the carotid arteries, the arteries running up the neck, through ultrasound, so it's non-invasive. And so what we've done in that particular study was we've taken patients that had stable carotid intima media thickness for the previous 3 years, and we just put them on Neo 40. And these were kind of subclinical plaque. It wasn't, probably less than 15, 20% stenosis. And then what we found was taking one lozenge twice a day for 6 months, we saw 11% plaque regression in those carotid arteries. And that was really, it was quite shocking. It was an endocrinology buddy of mine who wanted to do the study, and to my knowledge, there wasn't much that could lead to plaque regression. I mean, aggressive statin therapy, if you're on statins for, 3 years, you see at best about a 2.5% regression in plaque. And that's getting your cholesterol in the basement. So the ability to, and the observation that we could reduce plaque by 11% in 6 months with no side effects of statin therapy was really remarkable.
I would think that everybody who has carotid artery plaque ought to be on Neo 40.
Well, I think that's what the clinical data show us. It was a small study, but we've had this product on the market for over 10 years, and I get people that report to me that they're seeing plaque regression that basically mimics the results of that study. So it's not an epiphenomenon. We see it even outside that clinical study of people. Some people as much as a 90% stenosis of the carotid arteries. Within 3 or 4 months, the plaque is gone and you regress it to less than 20 or 30%, and this continues.
Yeah, I had a patient who had I think it was about a 40% plaque in his neck, and he dissolved it over 2 years with the Neo 40. But he did other things as well. But I mean,
I think that's an important point. I mean, it's not a silver bullet, right? You still have to make lifestyle changes.
Yeah.
But I think when you add this to lifestyle changes and other, but I'd say common sense things, and changing your diet and getting some moderate physical exercise, you can really see some pretty impressive changes.
I remember at the conference, I was asking you if Neo 40 helped with the erectile function, and you said it does. Are there any studies there?
We've got a lot of anecdotal data, but scientifically it makes perfect sense, because if you can't dilate the blood vessels of the sex organs, and that's both in men and women. You don't get engorgement, you don't get an erection, and you become anorgasmic. So if you can then dilate the blood vessels and get increased blood flow and engorgement, then you have better sexual function in men and women. So we've done one study, and this was in patients that were on low-dose Cialis, 5 milligrams Cialis for at least 90 days, either for ED or for BPH. And all we did was we added the Neo40 on top of their PD5 inhibition therapy. And we monitored them for 30 days. We crossed them over, allowed a 30-day washout period, and then crossed them over and put them on the active or the placebo. And what we found was quite impressive, that both their erectile hardness grading scores and their erectile function scores both improved, and symptoms of BPH improved. Wow.
That's awesome. The best part, I really am enjoying talking to you because you got a study for almost every question I have. I think that's the difference for, if you go online and just look for SuperBeets, or I think that's one of your products too, but just Beets and Nitric Oxide, there's a lot of products up there. I think it's helpful to have somebody who actually knows the science behind it, who has the studies behind it and stuff like that.
Well, no, I think you're right. We've gone above and beyond. In the dietary supplement nutrition space, you're not required to do clinical trials. But by the FDA, you just have to be safe, right? You just do no harm. But we think nitric oxide, now we know nitric oxide is so important that we can design clinically meaningful endpoints in randomized controlled clinical trials and see an effect. So that's kind of and I come from academia where you have to substantiate and be able to translate basic science into clinical medicine, or else what are we doing? I mean, that's the whole basis of doing basic science, is to make discoveries that can translate into making humans better and making patients better. But I will mention that, you made a good point. There are tons of products on the market, and I test every single nitric oxide product on the market, including all the Beet products out there. I mean, the market's saturated. But 95% of those Beet products on the market don't do anything but turn your poop and pee a red color and cause a little bit of anxiety. In fact, they don't have any nitrite, any nitrate. There's no nitric oxide activity whatsoever. So most of them are dead Beet products. That's all they are.
Wow.
So you have to be a little bit educated and informed as a consumer, that you're not going out there and wasting your money thinking you're getting a nitric oxide effect from a Beet product. And I think that's really important, because you mentioned the SuperBeet product is my product. It contains my patented technology, but there are a lot of products out there that don't do anything. And so what I tell people is you have to look for patents on products. And now there are SuperBeet products, the SuperBeet chews, and other SuperBeet products that don't contain any nitric oxide activity. So it's a minefield out there. And my job is to educate and inform consumers so they're not wasting their money and they can get the best benefit and be educated when they go out and shop for products. So look for patents on products. SuperBeets with patents on the back actually generate nitric oxide. The SuperBeet products with no patents don't have any nitric oxide activity whatsoever.
Now, when Neo40 first came out, it was with a company called Neogenis, and then it turned into Human N. Is that still a good place to get your products?
Yeah, so I started that company in 2010 with a couple of partners, and yeah, that company's been very successful. They still sell the Neo40, the SuperBeets, the Beet Elite is a great pre-workout Beet product. Yeah, that company has the license to my patents from the University of Texas. So Neo40, SuperBeet Original Powder, and the Beet Elite are my patented products, and so I still recommend people go there just to eliminate any confusion around what Beet products to buy. But it's the SuperBeet Original. Don't be confused by the other SuperBeet products.
What about oral testing? We had those test strips for a while. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, that was when we've been doing this for almost 12 years now, and when we first came to market with the nitric oxide technology, and you can probably remember this, Frank, patients didn't know anything about nitric oxide, and most physicians, primary care physicians, didn't know anything about nitric oxide because there weren't any drugs, no diagnostics really that revolved around nitric oxide. So we had to go out and really create a market for it. And then the number one question we got when we did market research and focus groups was, how do I know if I'm nitric oxide deficient? And it's not like vitamin D or cholesterol or triglycerides. There's not a blood lab that you can run and determine if you're low in nitric oxide. So we rely on symptoms. If you have high blood pressure, ED, vascular dementia, mild cognitive disorders, exercise intolerance, these are all important symptoms of nitric oxide. But still, people wanted a way to tell. And so we knew about this enterosalivary circuit whereby the saliva, we could pick up certain nitric oxide intermediates. And so we developed a nitric oxide test strip that you can apply some saliva on the end of it. And if it turns a bright pink, then that tells us that your body's able to utilize the nitrate from your diet and convert it into bioactive nitric oxide. But it could also mean that you have an active oral infection. So there are some false positives to that test. And, I think it's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but it shouldn't be the only tool you're using to determine whether or not you're nitric oxide deficient or you should be considering a nitric oxide-based product.
And if you had those test strips and you used a Neo40 first, is that a way to see if your Neo40 is still hanging around? How long does a Neo40 last?
Well, it's a good question. It depends on what endpoint we're looking at. So we haven't changed the physical chemistry of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is a gas. When it's produced in your body, it's gone in less than a second. So as that lozenge is dissolving, and we designed that to have about a 5 to 6 minute dissolution time, then it's generating nitric oxide gas. It's absorbed in the buccal cavity, and then, we can see dilation of the carotid arteries, usually within about 10 to 12 seconds of putting it in your mouth. So it's rapid acting. But if you look at the blood pressure lowering effects, and we've done 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure, and, you see one lozenge, you'll get blood pressure lowering effects if you have high blood pressure for about 8 to 10 hours. If you have normal blood pressure or low blood pressure, you don't see any change in blood pressure. So those are just the things that, so when people ask me that question, I go, well, it's a different answer for every endpoint. So the effects of nitric oxide last as long as the lozenge is dissolving. But in 2007, we were the first to discover a hormone function of nitric oxide. And so nitric oxide forms, endocrine mediators, like it binds to glutathione and is transported as this-nitrosoglutathione. And so you can basically extend the biological half-life of nitric oxide by looking at these, second messengers or endocrine mediators of NO.
I see. So that's how it can last that long, even though the gas is gone. You got the secondary mediators.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Again, if you just joined us, we're talking to Dr. Nathan Bryan about nitric oxide. This is the Dr. Frank Cutting Edge Medicine Show, brought to you by O3 Plus Texas. That's our health and wellness clinic here in San Antonio. The number is 210-558-7778, and we do have Neo40 lozenges for sale there as well. But I also wanted to know, you said something in one of your books about the dangers of the proton pump inhibitors. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so PPIs, or proton pump inhibitors, are a class of antacids that, were approved by the FDA, several decades ago for acute use of gastroesophageal reflux disease. But now, as time progressed, you can actually get these over the counter. There are over 200 million prescriptions written every year for PPIs, and with some pretty significant side effects, whether it's osteoporosis, a number of things. Actually, an increased risk, about a 30% increased risk of heart attack and stroke from people who have been on PPIs for 3 to 5 years. So that got, the scientific community to investigate what's the mechanism of this, what's it causing an increased risk in this. And so as it relates to nitric oxide, there are two ways that it's disrupting nitric oxide production. In fact, it shuts down NO production from both pathways we discussed earlier. So number one, it causes an increase in a molecule called ADMA, or asymmetric dimethylarginine. And that actually acts as an inhibitor of nitric oxide production through the NOS enzyme, or in the endothelium. And so that basically shuts down, causes endothelial dysfunction and loss of regulation of blood flow. The second thing it does, as intended, is it increases the pH of the stomach. And so you need stomach acid in order to make nitric oxide. So based on this salivary production pathway, when we swallow our own saliva, the nitrite in our saliva is protonated in the acid stomach and generates nitric oxide gas. But if there's no acid in the stomach, then nitrite doesn't become protonated and you don't get any nitric oxide production. So you basically become completely nitric oxide deficient, and that explains the 30 to 35% higher increased risk of heart attack and stroke. And then if you don't have stomach acid, you can't absorb things like iron, B vitamins, zinc, selenium, chromium, a lot of these trace minerals that most Americans are deficient in. So again, 200 million Americans are using an antacid every day, and those are just prescriptions. That's not even counting for the people who go to the pharmacy and buy the OTC Prilosec and Prevacid and Nexium, things like that. So It's a major contributor to chronic disease in America, and people don't understand that. But the mechanism is elucidated with 100% confidence based on all the published literature that antacids are your body cannot heal without stomach acid, and that's just the facts.
Wow. So basically we found two bad habits of Americans so far. We're not eating our vegetables, and, well, actually three of them. We're using mouthwash, and we're shutting off our stomach acid, so I guess it's no wonder we're so sick, which, when you look at the world death rate and from COVID, that's what it showed me, was that as a country we are just we're not doing all the right things to keep ourselves healthy, and it's shown up a lot quicker with this COVID epidemic. You had mentioned the other day that you had some kind of a research project going on with COVID. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, this is very exciting for us. So I started a drug company a couple of years ago, really to continue with my original mission of developing safe and effective drug therapies around nitric oxide. And we were after things like pulmonary hypertension, heart failure, ischemic heart disease, where nitric oxide would have a clear effect. And then COVID came, obviously, last year, and, it became evident early on to me, that the people that were getting sick and dying of COVID were the people that were showing signs of nitric oxide deficiency. These were people, over the age of 50 with high blood pressure, kidney disease, pulmonary issues, diabetics. Those were the ones that if you get COVID, it was very predictable. The disease rapidly progressed. Within 5 to 7 days of being exposed, you went in the hospital. The sick were usually put on a vent within, 8 or 10 days, and most people never come off a vent and they expire. But the majority of the population, recover. You got a 99.97% survival rate from COVID. So what we focused on was the sickest of the sick, and that just happens to be African Americans 50 to 85 with at least one underlying precondition. And that, whether that be high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, kidney disease. And we discovered and made some contributions probably almost 20 years ago that the health disparities of African Americans can be explained by a lack of nitric oxide production. So for those that don't know, African Americans have a much higher incidence of, high blood pressure, diabetes, kidney disease. African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, but 50% of the patients that are on dialysis.
Wow.
So why is that? Well, the health disparities can be explained by a lack of nitric oxide production. It can be explained through both genetic and lifestyle factors. So we submitted an investigative new drug application to the FDA and to study African Americans 50 to 85 recently diagnosed with COVID. And we developed a drug therapy for that. We've got the drug in phase 3 clinical trials. But really what we're doing is if you're African American 50 to 85 diagnosed with COVID within 72 hours, you enroll in our study and we begin the nitric oxide therapy immediately. Because we know that if we catch these patients early on and implement nitric oxide therapy, they don't progress, they don't get hospitalized, they don't need a vent, and they certainly don't die. And
wow.
we're seeing that in our clinical trials. This is a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. But we send these patients home with a pulse oximeter so we can monitor them remotely. We can look at their blood oxygen levels. We monitor their blood pressure, their symptoms. And you can see patients through our eCare 21 app and telemedicine platform, blood oxygen levels sometimes in the high 70s, low 80s. They take their study medication. 5 minutes later, it's 94. And Frank, you and I both know that's not a placebo effect.
That's pretty impressive.
Patient obviously got the active drug.
And so how are they getting the nitric oxide? Is it with like a Neo 40 tablet?
It is. We use the same basic technology. We just made it in a more potent drug formula. So whereas human has the rights to my patents for nutrition and dietary supplement, my drug company has the license to my patents for drug discovery.
Okay.
So we basically use the same technology, make it more potent, because this is actually a drug. It's not a dietary supplement. So you have to demonstrate both safety and efficacy in this FDA-approved clinical trial.
And how long is the trial going to go on? Is it still going on?
We have to enroll 840 patients based on the power analysis. If we wanted to reduce hospitalization by 25%, then we need 840 patients. We expect to have the study completely enrolled by June or July. It's a 30-day study, so we follow the patient for 30 days. And after 30 days, we look at rates of hospitalization. We look at the number of people that were admitted in the ICU and put on a vent, and we look at the number of deaths that occurred in both the active group and those on the placebo.
That is a fascinating study. What it's showing us all is, again, the ubiquitous actions of nitric oxide. You got it in, as antiviral, antibacterial, and then certainly a cell signaling molecule for the improvement of blood supply to the entire body. What about for cognitive impairment? Have you all had any studies or anything on it for that?
We did. We did a preliminary study in Mexico about 2 years ago where we took these patients were classified as mild cognitive disorders or vascular dementia, so not full-blown Alzheimer's, but just, they didn't perform well on a memory test. And we did functional MRI and looked at, blood flow to certain regions of the brain. And then we put them on Neo 40 twice a day for 30 days, came back, gave them the cognitive exam, and then looked at functional MRI and see if we could improve blood flow to certain regions of the brain. And after 30 days, not only did we improve their cognitive score, but you could show through functional MRI that you're actually improving perfusion to the prefrontal cortex and hypoxic ischemic regions before they were involved in the study. So that the changes in the functional MRI and the blood flow correlated quite nicely to the change in memory recall of these cognitive exams.
That's awesome. I got another question from a consumer point of view. If you, like here in the office, we sell Neo 40 Professional, which has folic acid with it. And on the web page from Human N, they sell a regular Neo 40, which doesn't have folic acid. How important is that difference?
Well, it's a differentiated product, and not only does it contain the methylfolate, but it also generates a little bit more nitric oxide.
Okay.
And we did that purposely to give healthcare practitioners really a differentiated product, because obviously they know a little bit more about the individual patients they're treating than just somebody grabbing a product on the shelf. So, the main component of that is for people with the methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase or MTHFR SNP that can't make basically reduced biopterin to tetrahydrobiopterin. So we put the methylfolate in there to help with BH4 production, and that's the rate-limiting step in nitric oxide production. So we give that to account for, the MTHFR patients. The majority of the population don't know if they do, but a lot of docs are doing, genetic testing and looking at different single nucleotide polymorphisms. And there's, I think some reports I've read that, 45 to 50% of Americans have an MTHFR SNP. And so it's more than a methylation issue. It becomes a nitric oxide product. And the Neo 40 Pro will address that, whereas the Neo 40 Daily does not.
Okay. Yeah, we've been checking the MTHFR on our sicker patients just to kind of see, and every one of them has a defect there. I don't think that's a coincidence. I mean, I think it is. I think it's definitely related, and I'm going to start checking more normal people just to see where they are, because it's a lot more common than everybody thinks. And when you add that together with the fact that people aren't eating their vegetables, they're not getting natural sources of any of the vitamins, and then if they can't methylate them in the next place, then we really have a problem. So.
To me, it became very clear of why Americans are so sick and why the people that are, so susceptible to COVID infection and getting sick from COVID. I mean, all of this can be fixed through nitric oxide. I mean, we're seeing it clinically, mechanistically, it makes sense. I mean, we haven't even done any surveys on, there's actually published studies of people that are on PPIs and antacids actually have an increased risk of infection of COVID. But I don't think there's any studies on use of mouthwash and what their diet is. But what's clear is if your body can make nitric oxide, and I'm probably the best example of that, we've got 6 clinical sites across the U.S. where we're testing COVID patients. And, I'm on an airplane every week, even throughout COVID for the past year. In these clinics, I've never been sick from COVID. In fact, I haven't been sick from any flu or viral or bacterial infection in over 20 years.
Wow.
And it's not that I haven't been exposed. I mean, I travel all over the world. It's just that my immune system knows how to deal with these foreign invaders. And that's how the body's supposed to work. When you're exposed to whether it's the flu or COVID and, they bind to these receptors, and most of the time it's in our airway, then our body recognizes that. Our immune system is activated. We generate nitric oxide, and it prevents the virus from replicating and propagating, and you don't get sick. So that's basic immunology. And so that's if you're healthy and your immune system is working, then there should be no fear of getting the flu or COVID or any infection.
Mm-hmm. But, I think there's just such a dearth of knowledge about how to stay healthy. That's what we're trying to do here, is let everybody know a little bit more about what to do to stay healthy. Because, this has been a beef of mine. If you would think that the NIH or the FDA would have commercials on what to eat, where every time you see a commercial for the wrong food on TV, they ought to have a government-sponsored ad that tells you what you really ought to be eating. But I guess it'll never happen because of the food lobbies. But anyway, I think
they have a different agenda than you and I, Frank.
Yeah, we're actually trying to keep people healthy. Well, we're going to switch gears just a little bit. Again, if you just joined us, we're talking with Dr. Frank Miller on the Dr. Frank Cutting Edge Medicine Show, talking to Dr. Nathan Bryan about nitric oxide and all of its various actions in the body. And we've talked about cardiovascular disease. We talk about immunology. And now we're going to move to another area. I was reading your book, and you mentioned that some scientists or researchers in the past thought there were vapors, and he called it pneuma, and you have a product called pneuma. And basically, you thought that this, who was that anyway, way back there?
That was Galen.
Galen, that's
Galen. He was the Roman physician in about 200 AD, and he thought, and he had this philosophy that the human body was animated by a gas. And so he called this gas pneuma, which basically translates into breath of life. So through my research, we basically made the connection that really what he was describing 2,000 years ago was nitric oxide. Wow.
So now you have a product called pneuma.
We do. We created a company called Pneuma Nitric Oxide where we created a topical. And really the basis for that was we knew that, my dad's a paraplegic from a car accident in 1984, and I've been dealing with these pressure ulcers, decubitus ulcers, mainly his adult life. And when I started, he had a non-healing, really infected ulcer, and so I started making a nitric oxide releasing gauze to treat his wound with, and found that, we could kill osteomyelitis, we could kill the infection, we could granulate the tissue, improve blood flow, and we healed the wound.
Wow.
So that, to me, had very important clinical implications. But, to get to the stage where we could do drug applications, we needed some preliminary data, and we needed, it cost a lot of money to develop a drug. So I thought, well, let's create a cosmetic, because nitric oxide has very important anti-aging properties. You can reduce fine lines and wrinkles and age spots and, things like that. So we created a skincare beauty product, and we called that N101. So 1 nitrogen, 1 oxygen for nitric oxide. We've got 4 published clinical trials on that. You mix these 2 chambers together and you rub it, and you can actually see the product work, and you can see it recruiting capillaries and increasing blood flow. And, to me, aging is very simple. It's a loss of oxygen and nutrients to every cell in the body. And you lose that oxygen nutrient delivery because you lose nitric oxide. So if you can restore nitric oxide, you can get oxygen and nutrients and blood to individual cells of the body. Those cells do their job, they turn over, they regenerate, and they perform their function. The cells of the skin, just for example, when they become dysfunctional, they don't turn over, they lose collagen, they lose hydration, and you get fine lines and wrinkles and saggy skin, and you look old. So what we're finding when you apply our nitric oxide serum, you can improve blood flow, improve oxygen nutrient delivery to these cells. They perform, they turn over, and fine lines and wrinkles go away. The skin looks better, glowing, healthy. It's quite remarkable.
And so if you're using it as a cosmetic, then you didn't have to go through as much rigorous steps as you would if it was going to be a drug. Is that what you were saying?
That's correct. So my strategy has always been, rather than going out and raising money and giving up control of companies from private equity or venture capitalists, my philosophy is let's go out and generate enough revenue to where we can do this on our own.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're doing now with the Pneuma company. We're basically using that technology to generate enough revenue to fund the more expensive drug trials through our drug company.
That is awesome. Well, so if you use the N101 or the Pneuma, are those the same, by the way?
Yeah, the company's called Pneuma Nitric Oxide. The skincare product is called N101.
Okay.
Just because people don't know what Pneuma is, and they had a hard time spelling it.
Yeah, with that P in the front of it, that's what it was.
Yeah. So I decided to stick to science instead of marketing.
And you have Susan Schaefer working with you. She was a great marketer. I remember about 5 years ago we saw her at one of the ozone conferences. Yeah.
Susan's great. She's become really well versed on nitric oxide, and she's been with me for more ttn 10 years now. At first with human, and now with our skincare company.
N101. So if people want to buy this or look up more information on the skincare thing, I believe the website is www.n101.com. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And then you have some different things. You got the basic cream, and then you have an eye cream, and what's this one? Age-defying face cream. So if you use all those, just a question, do you get nitric oxide into the rest of your body? Will it lower your blood pressure or anything?
We haven't. No, it doesn't, because then it would be considered a drug. But we can.
Oh, yeah.
We do that with our drug technology, and it's basically just a dose-dependent effect. So what we do with the skincare is we create a local effect, and you can see that. So, for instance, when you mix these two chambers together in the palm of your hand, you can rub it on your forearm, and you'll see that wherever you apply that serum, it'll turn a light pink, showing that there's an increase in blood flow to that area. And when you apply it to your face, a larger surface area, it's a little bit more subtle effect. But you can certainly see that through whether it's thermography or these other higher resolution imaging that a lot of these cosmetic surgeons and dermatologists use. But you can see the effects immediately. It's quite remarkable. It's a really cool show and tell.
And then the gas, though, so it doesn't stay around very long, but it's long enough to improve the structure and function of the skin.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm. I remember at the conference 2 years ago when you first were talking about this, I was asking you if it would improve the blood flow to everywhere that you put it on, including the genitals, and you said, of course it would.
Yeah, that's right. So that's we're a cosmetic, and we're very good at getting the wrinkles out.
All right.
So you can use that as you will.
That's right. That's right. So I guess you don't really have a clinical indication for that. By the way, if people are listening to some of the things that we talk about, if things are not FDA approved, like the things I mentioned in our ozone clinic, they're not designed to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease according to the FDA. And then you just have to go to international literature and see what it tends to do in other countries, and then you wonder why doesn't it do it in the U.S., but that's a whole other issue. But anyway, okay, so again, if you just joined us, we're talking with Dr. Nathan Bryant about nitric oxide, and this is brought to you by, this is the Dr. Frank Cutting Edge Medicine show brought to you by O3 Plus, our health, wellness, and longevity clinic here in San Antonio. Our phone number is 210-558-7778, or go to the website o3plustx.com. So back to nitric oxide, the things that we're talking about here with Dr. Brian, we are going to post some links on our webpage from the radio show, which is www.DrFrankCuttingEdgeMedicine.com, DrFrank CuttingEdgeMedicine.com. And we'll have a link to the Neo 40 site, to the N101 Cosmetic line. And then what else if they wanted to get in touch with you, Nathan, where do they find you?
I've got an educational website, Frank. It's drnathansbryan.com. There's no products on there. It's basically just an informative educational website.
Okay.
I do a monthly blog. There's some really cool videos on there that'll educate and inform on nitric oxide. And, follow me on Instagram at Dr. Nathan S. Bryan.
Okay. And then I think I'll also put a link to your books on there in case people want to learn a little bit more about that as well. So we've got about 10 more minutes, and I wanted to kind of recap a couple of things. So if a person is younger than 40, and they should be able to make nitric oxide from their vegetables that they eat, and the L-arginine, well, let's see, where do they get the L-arginine? Where does that come from?
Arginine is a semi-essential amino acid, meaning that it's produced partly through the urea cycle or partly in the body through the urea cycle. But then you get arginine from the breakdown of proteins, whether it's plant proteins or animal proteins. The proteins are made up of amino acids, primarily the 21 essential amino acids. And arginine is one of those. So when you break down proteins to amino acid, you get arginine, and you get it through the urea cycle. So arginine is never limiting. So it's never made sense to me in the nitric oxide space of taking arginine, because your body makes more than what it needs to bind to the enzyme to convert it to nitric oxide. Okay.
Well, is the nitric oxide synthase, is that limited?
Well, it becomes uncoupled, and that's really the rate-limiting step, and that's really through the oxidation of BH4, tetrahydrobiopterin.
Okay.
And so what you have to do is we have to recouple that enzyme, and once you do that, the enzyme becomes functional again and can then convert arginine to nitric oxide. So the analogy I've used for 20 years is taking L-arginine is like putting gas in a car with a blown-up engine. You may not be out of fuel or arginine, the engine's broken, so you can't convert it. So all these arginine products on the markets really do nothing in terms of nitric oxide. But there are other metabolic routes for arginine, stimulating growth hormone and things like that.
So if you're under 40, for example, and you eat, say, a Mediterranean-type diet, plenty of dark green leafy vegetables, you should, in theory, be able to make enough nitric oxide yourself, right?
Well, if you're not using mouthwash, you're not using antacids, and you don't have an oral infection to where you're disrupting the oral microbiome. Okay.
So then as we get older, that's when you can't do that naturally, and that's when we need some help from the, what did you call it, the enteric, no, what was it, the mouth?
Yeah, the oral microbiome, yeah.
Oral microbiome, okay.
Yeah, but, Frank, it's not really, we started this, years ago and called it Neo-40 because really we figured that, the over 40 population was our target. But here's what we're finding, and you probably see this in your clinic. There are 18, 20-year-old kids showing up with erectile dysfunction put on PD-5 inhibitors. And so they have a vascular age of, a 50 or 60-year-old, even though they're chronologically 18 or 20 years old. And to the contrary, they're, I'm 47 and I've got the vascular age of a 24-year-old.
Wow.
So you don't always match your chronological age doesn't always match your biological age. So what we have to do is just rely on symptoms and presentations and then interrogate and figure out, where the problems are. And almost always there's a disruption in nitric oxide production. So now I think people have to ask their patients, are you on antacids? Do you use a mouthwash? Do you have an active oral infection? Because you can have an active oral infection in those, whether it's gingivitis or periodontal disease or infected root canals, and then those bacteria actually outcompete the good bacteria, and you just have oral dysbiosis. So the bad guys outcompete the good guys. You can no longer produce nitrate to nitrite, nitric oxide. You become nitric oxide deficient, and it's a result of an oral infection. So then you got to go to a dentist and get that cleaned up. So it's a whole new way to practice medicine and to really start to interrogate the root cause of disease.
Yeah, we've had several dentists on the show talking about the importance of dental care as well. And then we've been talking a lot about nutrition. One of the areas we're going to go in the next couple of weeks is more about nutrition and preventing cognitive decline. But it sounds like the nitric oxide is probably the way that actually works.
I mean, look, like I said, it's not an end-all, be-all, cure-all, but scientifically it explains the etiology of almost every single human chronic disease. because every single chronic disease is associated with low blood flow, and you can do this through SPECT scans of the brain. And Daniel Amen's done this for years, where he looks at people with bipolar or addictive disorders or Alzheimer's, and there's always a loss of regulation of blood flow to certain parts of the brain. Same thing with coronary artery disease. What is that? Well, it's a loss of regulation of blood flow to the heart. Kidney disease, what's that? Well, it's loss of regulation of blood flow to the kidneys. So if you can restore blood flow and get oxygen nutrients to individual cells and tissues, they do their job. Give the body what it needs, and it heals itself.
Wow. Well, I just hadn't really thought about it, but I mean, like you say, with the younger people who are, anytime they come down with even the earliest sign of any vascular problem, they really need to get on this before they have to go, have something major done, and see if we can start to reverse the process, or get on it as a preventative I guess, as you come out of your teen years even. Yeah,
I think so. But I think we have to still understand the root cause. And if the Neo 40 does a lot. If your body can't make it, we do it for you. But I think it's still important to figure out why they're in poor health. Are they exposed to some toxin or infection? Are they missing a nutrient? And then, figure that out, because I think you and I both agree that the best medicine is always to try to, eliminate the cause of toxicity, whether it's infections or metal or non-metal toxicants. And then, most human diseases can be traced back to some nutrient deficiency. 95% of Americans are deficient in iodine, 75% in magnesium, chromium, selenium, and these are important trace minerals that the body needs. I mean, they're essential in biochemistry. And so if you replete the nutrients and remove the toxins, the body heals itself. And if you can generate blood flow and get oxygen to individual cells, which is mediated through nitric oxide, then you see a lot of things get better.
Seems like the only nutrient that we aren't deficient in is sugar.
That's right.
And that's our biggest problem. Well, I mean, to me, that was the unifier for so many other things is, impaired glucose tolerance, and then you get frank diabetes, and then it affects how your immune systems function, or don't rather, and then, you have a higher risk for all kinds of infections, cardiovascular disease, and then ultimately cancer. So I guess, let's see, did you mention that nitric oxide was helpful in cancers also, or I don't remember that part?
Well, cancer is kind of a strange disease, but to me, it's a metabolic disease. It's a mitochondrial disease, and you need nitric oxide Nitric oxide is what controls mitochondrial biogenesis. It prevents electron leakage through the electron transport chain. It binds to cytochrome C oxidase, so it regulates a lot of ATP production. And in cancer, particularly, you just have aerobic fermentation, where you become glycolytic and basically from a lot of things. And cancer cells only use sugar as an energy source. So it's basically just a metabolic disease. It's a mitochondrial disease. It's not a genetic disease. The genetics change in response to the metabolism.
Yeah, so it's interesting that it all comes down to the mitochondria too. And so you said that nitric oxide helps with production of more mitochondria?
That's right. It keeps the mitochondrial electron transport chain intact and prevents the electron leakage. So you basically you improve mitochondrial function, and this has been demonstrated in athletes. Nitric oxide improves performance, pushes back the anaerobic threshold, and this is based on mitochondrial bioenergetics. You improve ATP production with less oxygen, so you become more efficient. If you don't have nitric oxide, you become less efficient. And cancer is basically a disease of very inefficient mitochondria.
Have they looked at using the nitric oxide products along with exercising with oxygen or anything like that?
Yeah, there are a number of studies out there using primarily Beet products or standardized nitrate or nitrite products and looking at mitochondrial function and performance, whether it's time trials or perceived exertion. And there's a true clinical benefit to nitric oxide in performance. So
if a person was going to perform, they could take your SuperBeet, is that what that is, or the Beet Elite? Which one would that be?
It would be the Beet Elite. That's for sports performance.
So they would do that?
Yeah, we've got published clinical trials on this. The entire U.S. Olympic team has used our Beet Elite product. We've got over 180 professional NCAA teams that use that. So a lot of times when people see the red liquid in Gatorade, it's not red Gatorade. It's a lot of times it's our Beet product.
That is awesome. All right, well, Nathan, we're going to wrap it up. And so I guess for the audience, we need to come up with some healthy habits for them. So it sounds like we need to eat your veggies. Don't use mouthwash. Try not to block out your stomach acid unless your doctor says that you have to for some reason. And avoid oral infections. And then exercise regularly. Eat well and get plenty of rest. And I guess that's about it, right?
And sweat. You have to sweat. It's the main root of detox.
That sounds good. All right, well, for our listeners, thank you so much for listening. This has been Dr. Nathan Bryant, Ph.D., telling us all about nitric oxide, and I'm your host, Dr. Frank Miller from Dr. Frank Cutting Edge Medicine. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. And Nathan, have a great day. Thanks so much for educating us.
Thank you, Dr. Frank.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.